Welcome everyone, Questini here with a discussion about the High Elves in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. So in this case I'm using old world footage as techless. Where do I stand on the High Elves? I think they're one of the best races in the game to play, but they certainly have certain issues within the context of a fast-paced campaign in particular, as we currently see in Warhammer 3. They're probably much better to play in something like the Old World, because the Old World, due to the sheer size of everything, the distances involved between settlements, and the changing dynamics on the campaign map, in something like the Old World, the High Elves would probably perform better than they do in the baseline campaign of Warhammer 3. So, let's talk about the best, the worst, the pros, the cons. I would say one of the best things about the High Elves is the fact that they have incredibly varied campaigns. And I'm not talking here just about starting positions, no. I am talking about the mechanics of the Legendary Lords, the variety that you have. Tyrion is the closest you get to a generic lord for the High Elves. Well, he is the generic lord, but he has pretty powerful benefits for the baseline units that you want to use for the High Elves, spearmen and archers in particular. Techless has a focus on magic, especially because of the recruit rank +5 for Lorem masters, but in particular mages and archmages. And with archmages, being able to recruit a lord at rank 6 from the very beginning of your campaign for a secondary army is an incredible benefit. You then have Elfarion with his cave and Mistwalker units and the whole focus on that. You have Emmerich with his dragons. You have Alifanar, that's basically a Skaven Legendary Lord for the High Elves. You have Alariel, who is focused on handmaidens, sisters, forest spirits, and preserving the unity of Ulthuan. Regardless of which Legendary Lord you're playing as the High Elves, and certainly Techless of them in Immortal Empires is the worst by far, though he's still pretty solid to play. He's just kind of left behind compared to the others. It's mainly the campaign starting position that has always let Techless down. That's always been his issue. But regardless of that, regardless of which campaign you play, each experience is different, significantly so in certain cases. There's a lot of potential as a result of that. There's a lot of replayability as a result of that in High Elven campaigns. Furthermore, the army roster, the lords, the heroes, the options you have over here, archmages, princes, and to a lesser extent princesses who do suffer from the same problem that all ranged lords and heroes do have in Warhammer 3, in that they're not particularly useful in a campaign situation, given the way battles are played there. Multiplayer, a bit of a different affair. But in a campaign situation, they do certainly struggle because of the issues range units can have. Because like in a campaign, you're going to be having a duelist or a magic user leading your army is generally significantly more powerful. In terms of heroes, if we're looking at High Elves, we have powerful mages of many schools of magics, virtually all of them. We have Lore Masters of Hoeth as a hybrid hero between a caster or using buffing spells and being a melee duelist. Handmaids of the Everqueen, which are one of the best campaign heroes because of their campaign benefits. And also, of course, nobles for the sake of replenishment and melee dueling. What's great about the High Elven roster is that their baseline units are pretty solid, and in fact, if you're playing a High Elven campaign, you can most certainly win the entire campaign with just their baseline roster. But they do have a variety of units that are actually pretty solid as well. So if we're looking at their barracks chain, we see, like obviously archers with light armor are pretty useful, but you do have rangers, a duelist melee unit that you can recruit from tier 1. Not as much resistance, but a decent level of damage for tier 1 unit. Or the hybrid units of the London Sea Guard, Bear Spearmen with silver in, and the Shadow Warriors as a skirmisher range unit. Cavalry from Silver Shields is decent, but not necessarily worth focusing on because you can get better cavalry elsewhere. But certainly Silver Shields are decent enough as a cavalry unit. And of course, we can't ignore the Sisters of Avalorn from the Blessed Grove. And in point of fact, the White Lions of Crix are actually a fairly decent unit. Like, their armor is fairly high, so that means they're good in auto-resolve. Their stats, especially the fact that most of their damage is armor piercing, also is great. The lack of a shield does hurt them in range combat, but they're pretty decent otherwise. Other units, pretty decent, but basically what I'm saying, like spearmen or archers with light armor are so good as units that it's kind of hard to move on for that. You are lacking in artillery, that is one of the issues, but you do have some pretty powerful chariots, like Lion Chariots of Crix, and you have options in sieges, even if those options include massing a lot of range units and using them to kill everything beyond the walls. But you do also have monstrous units, so you have phoenixes, things like arcane phoenixes being pretty sweet, Phoenix Guard for a powerful melee unit, and then of course the really powerful dragons that the High Elves do have access to in their campaign. If there's any letdown in the roster situation for the High Elves, it's this. It is difficult to justify using other units when spearmen and archers with light armor in particular are so really powerful early on. It's annoying that you don't really have a lot of options, especially early on in the campaign until you get to a tier 3 settlement for breaking down walls. I mean, there are some, but you just don't have a whole lot of them. Those are some of the problems, and their melee roster situation, well, Sword Masters of Hoeth, White Lions, Phoenix Guard, they're pretty solid units, but they're not top tier units. So the melee situation for the High Elves is more that their melee units are meant to hold the line. Certainly they do have some special units capable of doing damage, but the main purpose of the melee line is to hold it while the range does damage. But you're not locked down a particular playstyle. You do have choices and variety. Problem is that in Warhammer 3, the campaign is very early game centric. So first 20 turns, first 30 turns, first 40 turns. Regardless of which difficulty you're playing on, regardless of how you play, the most important decisions are made within the first 40 and most 60 turns. After that, the campaign is over one way or another. Most likely, like if you survive past turn 60, with the exception of like something like an ultimate endgame crisis, you're highly unlikely to lose. That is the point. That's what I mean by the campaign being over. And this actually brings up the biggest issue of the High Elves. The biggest problem, and the reason why I do not consider them an S-tier race, but rather an A-tier race. And that relates to their design and the accessibility of a lot of the units and heroes that you do see. So High Elves do have powerful heroes. Handmaid is incredibly powerful, but you require a tier 4 settlement to recruit in most campaigns except Alariel, who can get them at tier 3, increase capacity at tier 3. But for most of them, for all other legendary lords, you need tier 4. Nobles also require tier 4. You can recruit one at tier 2. Some, like Emmerich, you can recruit quite a few of them through a special skill line, but for the most part, you're going to need tier 4 to recruit more than one noble. Mages and Lore Masters of Hoeth do require a tier 4 settlement. And this is the problem. There's certainly a great deal of hero variety, lord power, unit power, but it's locked behind high tiers. Now, High Elves have good growth. Not the best in the game, but it's certainly workable. But what this really means is when you're playing a High Elf campaign, you will have fewer armies with less unit variety and hero variety in them. Because you're required to get provincial capitals in order to increase your hero capacity. And you have other priorities as well in your campaign, rather than just in every single provincial capital getting every structure for hero capacity. Though that's certainly a way to do it. That's one of the problems, the limitations that you do have. there's other issues as well to talk about in a High Elven campaign that we should consider. First off, their economic situation. That's the economy of the High Elves, like with other aspects, it's good, but it's not perfect. It has its weak points. See, the thing about the High Elf economy, it is capable of generating a decent amount of money, all the way to 450 at tier 3. And there's also a second economic building with the promenade going into the amphitheater and provincial capitals. There's modifiers like the Elven Embassy and the Elven Court. But the problem is, like with other things, like with the unit roster, hero roster, and lords, there's limitations that make it so that this only really achieves its full potential in a very long campaign, which is irrelevant. This is actually the main fundamental problem when you're seeing with the High Elves. They don't work. They're not as fun to play, I would argue. They certainly do work, but they're not as fun to play. And the variety that they have in Legendary Lords kind of starts dying quite a bit when you realize that the important portions of the campaign are going to be fought with spearmen and archers with light armor, minus lords like Alifanar or Elfarian. That's one major significant downside, because when things start getting locked behind tier 4 as opposed to tier 3. And when the baseline units are so good that even getting the buildings for, like, there's no reason to bother with units here until you get to tier 3, and even then you're only getting silver and guard because archers with light armor, while Shadow Warriors are better, the upkeep difference, well, would you rather have more armies or single armies that are just slightly better? Keep in mind also the higher armor that archers with light armor do have does also count for something. And if we look at the difference in terms of missile strength, well, certainly archers with light armor have 17 missile strength as opposed to 20, and the Shadow Warriors only have 1 extra armor piercing missile damage. Those are some of the problems. And lacking in heroes means your armies also end up less interesting. Lacking in siege means your siege situation is pretty awful, to be honest. Like, I think that any faction that has a siege situation where you just park your archers just outside the settlement and kill everything inside is not a great gameplay situation at all. Like, the High Elves, of all the races in the game, like the High Elves are one of those races where you don't really necessarily have other choices. Unlike, say, the Dwarves, who, yeah, it's best to go for Quarrelers, but if you want to go with Dwarf Warriors, you can certainly go for Dwarf Warriors, just that Quarrelers are flat out better. Whereas, yeah, Spearmen are not going to break through a city gate and win. And you're basically stuck with them until you get to tier 3. I mean, I guess you could use Ladder and Sea Guard, but they're also not necessarily that great in melee. Like, Rangers and Ladder and Sea Guard could work, but, well, Rangers take a lot of damage, and making an entire army of them, it's a far weaker army than, say, an army of Hobgoblins or Nasty Skulkers, who already have their vulnerabilities. And the reason Nasty Skulkers work is because they can become far more upgraded as units. Going back to the economy situation, 2 particular problems do emerge. 1, to take advantage of the full economic might of the High Elves, you need to achieve 100 control. This is tailored more for longer campaigns than shorter campaigns. Again, the economy generates a decent amount of money, and the High Elves can certainly handle everything in the early game, but the real benefit of the High Elves is in a longer campaign. That's when they unlock their full potential. So what this means is you have a handicap early on compared to some other races that just generate more money than you. Dark Elves flat out outspend the High Elves and have greater unit variety because they're Black Arcs as opposed to the High Elves, and also get more heroes, and that's why I consider the Dark Elves better than the High Elves, personally. So that's one thing, the limitation based on control, but also the limitation based on trade, because the way these economic structures are built, a significant portion of the money is going to come from those elven trinkets. So while High Elves with a lot of trading partners may generate significant amounts of money, those without won't. This was one of the issues that significantly impacted Emmeric's campaign in Warhammer 2, and still continues to impact his campaign even in Warhammer 3, though to a lesser extent because of the changes in trading. But it's still a problem. So you either get a lot of trading partners or you don't. If you don't, you're probably going to struggle with money. That is the reality of the situation the High Elves have to deal with. And it's the reason why, despite everything else, Tyrion and Alariel are such powerful legendary lords, because of their ability of generating these agreements. Also, Elfarion, of course, can handle it, but Tyrion has remained one of the most powerful legendary lords in the game for one of these reasons, for many reasons, but one of them is his ability of getting trade agreements, compared to being isolated in a corner of the map, like Teclis or Emmerich, who can't. Elfarion can, but not quite to the same extent. Though it depends on what campaign playstyle you choose for Elfarion, whether or not you hold Tor of Rest or not. That's something to take into consideration. Finally, we get to the situation of influence. On one hand, with spending influence, you can get some pretty powerful lords, but on the other side, you do have, if you're not spending influence for lords and heroes, you will simply not have powerful ones, and you will get downsides. Imagine recruiting a lord with disorganized that will increase the upkeep for your archers. Not a great situation. The problem with this, like with other systems, is it creates the issue where you get to, like early on, you start for influence, later on you have more influence than you can spend on. That's the issue of this system. And you're spending it on this. Though, to be fair, with influence, one of the benefits, and again, that mentality that we see again and again, we can use influence to manipulate diplomacy. Elves are masters of diplomacy in that respect. That's one of the reasons they work so well with trade. Their economy is built on trading with a lot of people, and intrigue at court helps with that. Finally, there is the research tree. There's some pretty powerful stuff, but what's really frustrating about this research tree, you have a situation where to unlock even some basic things, you are required, like beyond the military advancements, you're required to get a significant number of buildings that you may not care for in any way, shape, or form. So for instance, for military advancements 2, we need an archive. That requires you to get to tier 3. So you may be playing a significant portion of the early game severely limited in what you can research. To be certain, archer prowess is always worth it, spear wall, militia training, but a lot of the other things that you can get are going to be locked behind that. To give you a sense of how powerful High Elves can become later on, you have a research over here that requires 2 buildings, Elven Court and Shrine of Asuryan. Shrine of Asuryan is a worthless building at tier 3. And you also need to get the Elven Court. Once you get the tier 4 building, so you're looking at 20 turns or so in your campaign at least to do it, you start unlocking a research tree that gives you things like campaign movement range, diplomacy benefits, Lord Recruit rank. This entire tree of spy networks ends up being incredibly powerful in the long term. That is the main downside of the High Elven design. That it's not that they're weak. Again, I emphasize, they're not weak early game. You can win against any opponent in any campaign in the early game. It's they're less interesting to play because of all the limitations that you have in the early game that expire in the late game. And so you end up with a race that can have decent enough campaigns early on, but dominates late game. I don't think it's a campaign playstyle that any of them have that ends up working very well for the sake of the gameplay style that we see in Warhammer 3. It might work better in something like the Old World. Actually, it will work a lot better in the Old World because the Old World will ultimately end up handling more slowly. But even with the Old World, it's just not necessarily a superb design. And that is where I stand on them. Powerful roster, powerful lords, powerful legendary lords, powerful heroes. But just the design that need some updates for the current context of Warhammer 3. As someone posted on my Tomb Kings video, they need a glow up. So they basically need some updates to work better within this context, but there's no major changes they need to make for the race as a whole. And make no mistake, I like the Tomb Kings because this is a major difference. The Tomb Kings are horrible to play in the early game because their unit roster in the early game is incredibly limited and weak. The High Elves, while they may not be able to recruit as many unit types as some other races, their base spearmen and archers will shred anything that stands in their path. Armor piercing might not be so great, but they will handle it. Like, you throw an army of warriors casting against the High Elves in a pitch battle with the legendary lord of the High Elves leading that, the High Elves will win. They are one of the races that consistently can go toe-to-toe against the absolute juggernauts of this game and win. And invading Wolf 1 for any legendary lord, for any race, is an absolute nightmare. So they're a powerful race, but just need some updates to work. That's all I had to say. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. Stay tuned for more.